Daniel had never thought much about evening classes before. Most of his friends went to university during the day, rushing from lecture halls to cafes, then home to scroll through their phones until late at night. But for him, life had taken a slightly different turn. He was 20 years old, still figuring out what he truly wanted to do. His family lived in a small town a few hours away, and money was tight. So Daniel decided to work part-time in the mornings at a local bookstore and take literature classes at the community college in the evenings. The first time he walked into the small, warm-lit classroom, he noticed that it felt different from the noisy, crowded places where he had studied before. There was a quietness here, not the uncomfortable silence of boredom, but the kind that comes when people are paying attention. The walls were lined with shelves of old books, their faded spines hinting at decades of stories. The wooden desks had marks from pens, and the faint smell of paper and chalk hung in the air. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Eleanor Brooks. She was unlike any teacher Daniel had met before. Her hair was silver and neatly tied back, her glasses resting low on her nose as she looked over her notes. She didn't try to impress her students with loud energy or modern jokes. Instead, she spoke calmly, her voice steady, as if every word was chosen with care. Daniel noticed she had a way of looking at each student when she talked, as though she wanted to make sure they understood not just the lesson, but the meaning behind it. That first class, Mrs. Brooks spoke about poetry. She read aloud a short verse by Emily Dickinson, pausing after each line so the words could breathe. The room was still. Even Daniel, who had come here mostly to improve his writing for practical reasons, felt a quiet pull toward the rhythm of her reading. Was strange. She didn't make poetry sound like something trapped in old books. She made it feel alive. After class ended, most students packed their bags quickly and left. Daniel stayed a moment longer, putting away his notebooks slowly. He noticed Mrs. Brooks wasn't in a hurry to leave either. She stacked her papers neatly, adjusted the chairs in perfect rows, and even erased the board herself. There was no rush. In her movements, it was as if this quiet time after everyone left belonged to her. Over the next week, Daniel began to notice a pattern. Every evening, Mrs. Brooks lingered in the classroom for 10 or 15 minutes after the students had gone. Sometimes she wiped the desks. Sometimes she stood by the window, looking out at the darkening campus, her face thoughtful. Daniel didn't know why, but something about it made him curious. One evening, after a class on classic novels, Daniel stayed behind. He told himself it was to ask a question about the assignment, but a small part of him simply wanted to see if Mrs. Brooks would talk to him. She was erasing the chalkboard when he approached. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, a little unsure about the essay you mentioned. He said we could write about any author we admire. She turned to face him, smiling faintly. "Yes, Daniel. Any author you connect with. That's the key. If their words speak to you, your writing will carry more life." They ended up talking for nearly 20 minutes. The conversation drifted from the essay to books they had both read. Daniel mentioned his part-time job at the bookstore, and Mrs. Brooks lit up, asking if they still had certain old editions she remembered. She told him about her own first teaching job decades ago, in a school so small that the library fit into a single cupboard. When Daniel finally left the classroom, the hallway was empty. He walked out into the cool night air feeling strangely lighter, as though a simple conversation had left him with something valuable. He didn't know why, but talking to her didn't feel like talking to a typical teacher. It was more like speaking to someone who understood things quietly, without the need for long explanations. As the weeks passed, Daniel found himself staying behind after class more often. Sometimes it was just for a few minutes, sometimes longer. They spoke about writing, about the weather, about how the town had changed over the years. Mrs. Brooks listened in a way few people did, her eyes steady, her hands folded, her mind clearly present. It was rare to meet someone who wasn't distracted, who wasn't half listening while thinking of something else. Daniel learned that Mrs. Brooks had been widowed for over 10 years. Her husband had been a kind man who loved music, and they had 2 children who now lived abroad. "They call often," she said once, "but it's not the same as seeing them." She didn't sound bitter, just quietly honest. She admitted, That teaching was more than just a job for her. It was her way of keeping her mind active and her heart connected to people. It struck Daniel how much life could change over the years. Here was someone who had lived through joys and losses, yet still showed up every evening to help a room full of students understand literature. He respected that, and without realizing it, he began to look forward to class not just for the lessons, but for the moments afterward when the world slowed down and they could talk. One chilly evening, after the first frost had dusted the grass, outside, Daniel arrived early to class. Mrs. Brooks was already there, arranging some books on her desk. She looked up with mild surprise. "You're early, Daniel?" "I had an extra hour," he said. "Thought I'd read before class." She nodded approvingly and gestured toward the shelves. "You might find something in there worth your time." Daniel browsed the books, pulling out an old, worn copy of Robert Frost's poems. The edges were frayed, the cover soft from years of handling. He sat down and started reading, and when Mrs. Brooks began the lesson, she noticed the book in his hands. Later, she mentioned how her late husband had loved Frost's work, and for a moment, Daniel saw a softer expression on her face, a mixture of memory and affection. That night after class, as he packed his bag, he realized something unusual had happened. He had begun to care about literature in a way he never had before. More than that, he cared about the conversations they shared. It was as if in a quiet corner of the world, a bridge was forming between two very different lives, a young man at the start of his journey, and a woman who had already walked many roads but still had stories to tell. By the end of that first month, the others in the class seemed to notice he often stayed behind. A few students joked lightly about him being the teacher's helper, but Daniel didn't mind. The truth was, he wasn't helping out of duty. He stayed because those talks made the classroom feel less like a place for grades and more like a place for understanding, not just about books, but about people. Mrs. Brooks never treated him like a child, or like an equal in age, but rather as someone worth speaking to, someone whose thoughts mattered. For a 20-year-old finding his way, that meant more than he could put into words. And though neither of them said it aloud, there was an unspoken awareness that something uncommon was happening. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way, but in the simple unfolding of trust, one quiet evening at a time. Daniel's routine slowly began to change in small, unnoticed ways. His mornings were still busy with work at the bookstore, and his evenings were still spent in Mrs. Brooks' literature class. But there was now a little more purpose in his steps. He didn't just rush in for the lesson anymore. He arrived a bit earlier, sometimes with a book tucked under his arm, ready for another exchange of thoughts with the woman who had, without meaning to, become an important part of his week. It happened gradually, but their talks began to stretch beyond the classroom. One evening, after the last student left, Mrs. Brooks invited him to join her for tea in the small faculty lounge. The place was simple, just a couple of tables, an old kettle, and shelves filled with mismatched mugs. She poured the tea with careful hands, placing a cup in front of him. "Milk? Sugar?" she asked. "Just a little sugar," Daniel replied. The tea was warm, but the conversation was warmer. They spoke about his family, about the town where he grew up, and about her life in this one. Daniel learned that Mrs. Brooks had been teaching for over 40 years. "I started when I was younger than you are now," she said with a soft smile. "Back then I thought I'd only teach for a few years. But the years have a way of piling up when you're not counting them." Daniel smiled. "I guess you must love it then." "I do," she said. "It keeps me connected." Books may not change the whole world, but they can change the world for one person at a time. That's enough for me. From that day on, having tea together became something of a habit. Not every night, but often enough that Daniel began to look forward to it. It wasn't like talking to a classmate or a friend his own age. There was no rush to fill the silence. There was a pause. It wasn't awkward. It was just a moment to sip tea and think. One rainy Thursday evening, Daniel walked into the lounge to find a plate of homemade cookies waiting on the table. "I baked too much," Mrs. Brooks said, her tone light, but her eyes watching his reaction. "Thought you might help me get rid of them?" Daniel laughed, breaking one in half. "These are really good. It's better than anything I've bought in town. They're an old recipe," she said. My mother used to make them when I was your age. It was in these moments that Daniel noticed something he hadn't before. Mrs. Brooks didn't just teach literature. She lived in stories. Every little detail she shared came with a thread of memory, connecting the present to some distant past. They began to trade little pieces of their worlds. Daniel brought her a rare book he found at the store, a collection of poems that wasn't in perfect condition but still held charm. In return, she lent him a novel she had read when she was 20, telling him, "I'd like to see what someone your age thinks of it now." Sometimes their talks turned toward more personal matters. Daniel spoke about the challenge of balancing work and studies, about feeling like he was always behind his friends who had gone straight to bigger universities. Mrs. Brooks listened. Without rushing to give advice, though she occasionally shared gentle reminders, "Life isn't a race," she said one evening as she stirred her tea. "Some people run fast, some walk slow. But it's not about speed. It's about whether you're paying attention to what you pass along the way." Daniel thought about that often. Their connection deepened in quiet ways. After class, he would sometimes walk her to the parking lot, carrying the heavy bag of books she always seemed to have. She never asked, but she always thanked him sincerely. In return, she began bringing small things for him: an apple from her garden, a bookmark she had kept for years, a packet of seeds she thought he might plant. It wasn't that they spent all their time together. They still had their separate lives, Daniel with his job and occasional outings with friends, Mrs. Brooks with her routines and solitary evenings. But in those shared moments after class, there was an unspoken understanding that they enjoyed each other's company. One early winter evening, the air sharp and cold, Daniel arrived to find Mrs. Brooks looking out the classroom window.
Ow.
Snowflakes drifted past the glass, the first of the season. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said without turning around. Daniel nodded. "Makes the whole world look quiet." "It does," she said softly. "I like the first snow. It makes everything feel fresh, like a blank page." That image stayed with Daniel the world. As a blank page, he realized that was how Mrs. Brooks seemed to view life, even at her age. Not as something closing down, but as something still open to new words, new chapters. Not long after, she invited him to her home for the first time. "I have some old gardening books I think you'd like," she explained. Daniel hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure if it was proper, but her tone was casual and friendly, so he agreed. Her house was small but warm, filled with books, and little signs of a life well lived: photographs in wooden frames, potted plants on the windowsill, and a faint scent of lavender. She showed him the books, but also the small backyard where she said she hoped to grow more vegetables in spring. "Used to do it all myself," she said with a chuckle, "but the knees don't like bending as much as they used to." Daniel offered to help when the season came, and she smiled in a way that told him she appreciated the thought more than she said aloud. Back in class, their interactions didn't disrupt the lessons. To the other students, Mrs. Brooks was the same as always: professional, kind, but reserved. It was only in those after-hours talks that her softer side appeared, and Daniel felt privileged to see it. Over time, he noticed little things about her: the way she always carried a handkerchief neatly folded in her pocket, the habit she had of tapping her pen twice before starting to write on the board, the quiet laugh she sometimes let out when recalling an old memory. These small details made her seem less like just a teacher and more like a whole person, with layers and stories behind every gesture. The trust between them grew without either of them planning it. It wasn't forced, didn't need big declarations or dramatic moments. It was built in cups of tea, in shared walks to the parking lot. In the exchange of books and ideas, Daniel began to understand something about life that he hadn't before. Sometimes the most meaningful relationships are the ones that form when you're not looking for them. They just happen, like snow falling quietly in the night, unexpected, but beautiful when you see it in the morning. And while neither of them would have called it extraordinary, it was already becoming a story that was theirs alone, a story no one else would have predicted, but one that mattered deeply to both. The day had started like any other. Daniel had worked his morning shift at the bookstore, unpacking boxes of new arrivals and helping a few regular customers find the books they wanted. The winter sky was already heavy with clouds when he left, For his evening class, the air damp and cold. By the time he reached campus, a light drizzle had begun to fall, dotting his jacket with tiny dark spots. The classroom felt especially cozy that evening. The old radiators hummed quietly, and the yellow light from the ceiling lamps made the room glow warmly against the gray sky outside. Mrs. Brooks began the lesson as usual, her voice calm and measured, guiding the class through a discussion of a short story by Ernest Hemingway. Daniel found himself deeply focused, more engaged than usual, because she had a way of asking questions that made him think about the story in a new light. As the class neared its end, a sudden rumble of thunder rolled across the campus, followed by a flash of lightning. The rain, which had been soft and steady, turned into a heavy downpour. Students exchanged glances and started packing up quickly. Eager to get home before the weather got worse, Mrs. Brooks ended the class with a simple, "Stay safe on your way home," but the storm seemed to answer her with another loud crash of thunder. One by one, the students hurried out, their voices fading down the hall until the building was nearly silent. Daniel lingered behind, glancing at the sheets of rain outside. "I think I'll wait for it to slow down," he said, setting his bag. Back on the desk, Mrs. Brooks nodded, not seeming surprised. Might be wise. The parking lot gets slippery in heavy rain. She moved to close the classroom windows, which rattled in the wind. As she reached the last window, a sudden flicker of the lights made them both pause. Then, with a soft click, the power went out completely. The room was plunged into dimness, lit only by the faint gray light from the stormy sky outside. "Well," Mrs. Brooks said with a small laugh, "that's inconvenient." Went to her desk and pulled open the top drawer, taking out a small battery-powered lamp. She switched it on, and a soft glow spread across the desk, casting gentle shadows on the walls. The rain hammered against the windows, the sound steady and almost rhythmic. Daniel sat back down, feeling the strange comfort of the enclosed space. Without the hum of electricity, the room felt quieter. It's almost like they were in a different time. Mrs. Brooks reached for a book on her desk. It's an old collection of poems, and looked at Daniel. "Would you like to pass the time with something? To read? It might make the wait more pleasant." He nodded, and she opened the book to a page marked by a thin ribbon. Her voice, already steady in class, seemed even softer in the lamplight as she began to read aloud. The words rolled gently into the quiet room, each line carrying weight, each pause filled with the sound of rain. Daniel listened, watching how her expression shifted slightly with each verse. A small smile here, a thoughtful crease in her brow there. It was different from hearing her in class. This felt more personal, almost like she was sharing something private, something she loved, not because it was part of a lesson, but because it was part of her. When she finished the poem, she closed the book halfway and looked at him. "Would you like to read one?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm not as good at reading aloud as you are," she smiled gently. "It's not a performance, Daniel. Just words shared between two people." But he took the book and read the next poem. His voice wasn't as smooth as hers, but he noticed she listened the same way he did, fully present, her eyes on him, as though every word mattered. By the time he reached the end, he realized he'd stopped worrying about how he sounded. They passed the book back and forth like that, reading poems until the rain began to ease. The conversation between each reading drifted into other topics, books they both loved, places they dreamed of visiting, moments from their childhoods. Mrs. Brooks told him about her first trip to the seaside when she was a little girl, how she had been afraid of the waves until her father held her hand. Daniel told her about the time he had helped his grandmother plant roses in her garden, and how the flowers had bloomed more beautifully than anyone expected. At one point, the wind rattled the windows again, and Mrs. Brooks looked toward the dark outside. "Storms have a way of making time feel slower," she said softly. "Sometimes I think we need that." A pause. Daniel agreed. "Everything feels quieter, even though it's noisy outside." "No?" She gave a small, knowing smile. "Yes, it's the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think." It struck Daniel that this was the longest he had ever spent alone with her outside of their usual class ending. And yet, it didn't feel strange. There was no awkwardness, no rush to fill the silence. They simply shared the space, letting the storm decide when it would release them. Eventually, the rain softened to a steady drizzle. The power came back with a faint hum, the overhead lights flickering to life. Daniel blinked against the sudden brightness, almost wishing they could have stayed in the warm dimness a little longer. Mrs. Brooks switched off the lamp and placed it back in her desk. "Looks like it's safe to head out now," they gathered their things, and Daniel carried her bag to the door. As they stepped into the damp air, the smell of rain-soaked earth rose around them. The campus was nearly empty, the puddles on the path reflecting the faint glow of streetlights. "Thank you for staying," she said as they walked toward the parking lot. "It made the evening much nicer." Daniel smiled. "I should be thanking you. I wouldn't have thought to read poetry in the dark." She glanced at him with a warm expression. Sometimes the unexpected moments turn out to be the most meaningful. That night, as Daniel drove home through the wet streets, he thought about her words. He realized that the storm had given them more than just an hour of shared poems. It had shown him a side of her that he wouldn't have seen in a normal class. She wasn't just the teacher at the front of the room. She was a person who found beauty in pauses, who could turn a power outage into something worth remembering. And for the first time, Daniel felt that their connection had shifted still. Respectful, still built on the roles of teacher and student, but now carrying a quiet depth that neither of them had planned for. The days after the storm felt different, though nothing obvious had changed. Classes continued as normal, with Mrs. Brooks discussing novels, marking assignments, and guiding the students through the syllabus. Yet for Daniel, there was now a quiet familiarity in their interactions. A sense that the storm evening had left behind something unspoken, but understood. He found himself noticing small opportunities to help her, not because he felt he had to, but because it felt natural. On particularly cold evenings, he would arrive early and make sure the classroom windows were shut tight so she wouldn't have to cross the room in the draft. If she was carrying too many books, he would take the heavier stack without a word. She never demanded it, but she always gave a small, sincere thank you. Daniel in return. One afternoon at the bookstore, Daniel came across a novel they had talked about during the power outage. It was an older edition, its cover worn but still attractive. Without much thought, he bought it and brought it to class that evening. "I thought you might like this," he said, handing it to her before the lesson began. Mrs. Brooks turned it over in her hands, her eyes brightening. "This is a beautiful edition. I haven't seen this one in years." She looked up at him with a soft smile. "You remembered?" "It reminded me of that night," Daniel said simply. She placed it carefully in her bag, as though it were something fragile. That small exchange stayed with them both. A week later, Mrs. Brooks brought something for him in return, a slim, leather-bound notebook. "For your own writing," she explained. "What?" "Every writer needs a place for their thoughts, even the small ones." Inside the front cover, she had written, "Words are seeds. Plant them with care." It was the kind of gift that felt deeply personal, and Daniel carried it with him from then on, jotting down ideas during his breaks at work or before. That their shared gestures didn't stop at gifts. As winter turned to early spring, Mrs. Brooks mentioned one evening that she wanted to start a small vegetable patch in her backyard, but hadn't managed to clear the space. Daniel offered immediately. "I can help," he said. "It's not that hard to dig out the ground." She hesitated, as if unsure whether to accept, then nodded. "All right, but only if you let me feed you afterwards." That Saturday, Daniel arrived at her home in the mid-morning. The sun was out, though the air was still crisp. Led him through the back door into a modest yard where a few flower beds lined the fence. At the far end, a patch of soil waited, half covered in weeds. Together, they began pulling up roots and loosening the earth. She worked alongside him, wearing gardening gloves and an old straw hat, pointing out where the best sunlight would fall in the summer. They talked as they worked, their conversation moving easily from books to recipes to the little habits of the neighborhood birds. At one point, Daniel paused to stretch his back and noticed her looking at the garden with a small, satisfied expression. "I used to do all this with my husband," she said quietly. "Feels good to be out here again." By the time they finished, the patch was neat and ready for planting. Mrs. Brooks insisted on making lunch, and they ate at a small wooden table in her kitchen. Fresh bread, soup, and a slice of pie she had baked the day before. Daniel realized it had been a long time since he had sat at a table like this, in a home that felt so steady and calm. In the following weeks, they kept each other updated on the garden. Mrs. Brooks would mention the first sprouts during class, and Daniel would smile at the thought of their shared project taking root. Sometimes she would bring in a few herbs or small vegetables they had grown together, wrapped neatly in paper for him to take home. Their connection also grew through moments outside the classroom. Daniel had been invited to read some of his short poems at a small cafe's open mic night. He didn't expect her to come. It was late in the evening and not near the college, but as he stepped onto the little stage, he saw her sitting near the back, hands folded, watching intently. Afterward, she came up to him, her smile warm. "You read beautifully, Daniel. You have a way of letting the words breathe. It means a lot that you came," he admitted. "I didn't think you'd want to spend your evening here." "I wanted to see what you've been working on," she said simply, "and I'm glad I did." From then on, whenever Daniel felt uncertain about his writing or his future, her encouragement returned to him like a steady voice in the background. She didn't give long speeches or push him with pressure. She simply believed in him, and that belief was enough to make him believe in himself a little more. Even the smallest exchanges seemed to carry weight. One evening, she left a folded slip of paper on his desk before class. Inside was a quote, "The best teachers show you where to look, but don't tell you what to see." Daniel kept it tucked in the back of his notebook, taking it out whenever he needed a reminder. There were still moments when the difference in their ages and lives was clear. She spoke about times and events that he only knew from history books, while he sometimes mentioned music or trends she had never heard of. But instead of feeling like a barrier, these differences became part of what made their conversations rich. Each had a world to share that the other had never fully experienced. And while to an outsider it might have seemed like nothing extraordinary, just a teacher and a student talking after class, for them, it was a quiet exchange of trust and kindness. No one else needed to understand it. By the time spring settled fully in the garden they had worked on was green and thriving. Ace Brooks invited him over one sunny afternoon to see it, and together they stood by the patch looking at the neat rows of plants. "Not bad for a start," she said, brushing soil from her gloves. "Looks better than I imagined," Daniel replied. She glanced at him with a smile. "It's amazing what a little care can do for gardens and for people." Daniel thought about that for a long moment, realizing that the same could be said for their unlikely friendship. It had started with small, almost unnoticed acts, staying behind after class, sharing a cup of tea, carrying a bag of books. But over time, those moments had built something steady and real. As he left her house that day with a small basket of fresh herbs in his hands, Daniel felt a quiet gratitude. He knew that life would eventually take him to other places, and that they might not always see each other as often. But no matter where he went, this chapter filled with shared work, shared words, and shared care would remain one of the most valuable parts of his story. The months passed quickly, and spring gave way to summer. Daniel's time at the community college was drawing to a close. He had been accepted into a university in a larger city, a step that both excited and worried him, leaving the small town. The familiar faces and the quiet routine was not easy. Mrs. Brooks seemed to understand this better than anyone. One evening, as they sat together in the faculty lounge after class, she handed Daniel a small, leather-bound journal. It was soft and well-made, with a ribbon to mark pages. "For your writing," she said simply. "A place to keep your thoughts, your dreams, your stories." "Why?" Daniel looked down at the gift, touched by the care in her words. Inside the front cover, she had written a short note: "For the words you will write, the dreams you will chase, and the kindness you will never lose." He felt the weight of it, not just the book itself, but the meaning behind it. It was more than a gift. It was a symbol of her belief in him, her hope for his future. "I don't know what to say," Daniel said quietly. "You don't have to say anything," Mrs. Brooks replied with a smile. "Just promise me you'll keep writing." He nodded. "I promise." Their last few weeks together were filled with a mixture of ordinary moments and quiet goodbyes. They still talked after class, still shared books and stories, But there was a gentle understanding that soon the rhythm would change. One afternoon, Daniel came early and found Mrs. Brooks tending to her small garden. The plants were flourishing, bright and green in the summer sun. She looked up as he approached and handed him a small bunch of herbs. "Take these with you," she said. For a taste of home, he accepted them gratefully. "Thank you." They stood for a moment, the warm breeze stirring the leaves around them. "I've learned so much from you," Daniel said finally. "Not just about literature, but about life, about patience and kindness." Mrs. Brooks smiled softly. "And I from you. You reminded me that connections can happen at any time, between any two people, if we're open to them." Daniel thought about all the evenings spent reading poetry in the dark, sharing tea, working in the garden. How a quiet friendship had grown from simple moments. On his last night before leaving town, Daniel and Mrs. Brooks met for tea one final time. The faculty lounge felt familiar and comforting, yet tinged with the sadness of parting. They talked about the future, his hopes for university, her plans for the garden, the books they still wanted to read. Neither spoke about the distance that would soon come between them as the evening ended. Mrs. Brooks pressed a small envelope into Daniel's hand. "For when you need a reminder," she said softly. He opened it later in his room and found a letter inside. It spoke of courage, of embracing change, and of holding on to the kindness that made life rich. That letter became one of Daniel's most treasured possessions. Years passed. Daniel grew into his new life, studying hard and writing. Often, whenever he felt uncertain or overwhelmed, he would open that leather journal and reread Mrs. Brooks's note. Her words gave him strength. He visited her when he could, returning to the small town to see the garden they had nurtured together, share new poems, and to sit quietly over tea. Mrs. Brooks continued teaching, her gentle presence inspiring new generations of students. She spoke of Daniel with pride, telling colleagues about the young man who had brought light into her life in unexpected ways. Their story was not one of grand adventures or dramatic events. It was a story of connection, simple, honest, and quietly powerful. A reminder that sometimes the people who shape us the most are those who walk beside us in the everyday moments. And for Daniel and Mrs. Brooks, that was enough, was everything.